Good morning and welcome to another edition of the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. First, this just in, Ronnie Wilson, founder, member of the R&B group The Gap Band, has died at the age of 73. His passing was confirmed this morning by his wife, Linda Bulwell Wilson. She posted on Facebook that the love of my life was called home this morning at 10:01 a.m. Please continue to pray for the Wilson, Bulwell, and Collins family while we mourn his passing. Ronnie Wilson, the founding member of the Gap Band, has died. We have lots of news to get to this morning, including Pfizer has approved to start providing COVID vaccines for children 5 to 11. And last night, voters sent a clear message that they are not happy with Democrats early as this morning there is the New Jersey race that's still to be decided. And in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed by police, voters in the city rejected a ballot measure to overhaul policing drafted amid the national fury over George Floyd's murder by a police officer. Voters went to the polls and they raised concerns about gun violence and other violence in the police department. Today, we speak with Michelle Gross of the Committee United Against Police Brutality in Minneapolis. Journalist James Wright joins us, and from Insight News, Al McFarlane will join us. But first, the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association joins us from Atlanta, Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr. Good morning, Dr. Chavis.
Good morning. About to board a plane in Atlanta coming back to Washington. But on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Karen Carter Richards, our distinguished chair, representing Al McFarlane and 229 other African-American owned newspapers and media companies across the country. We're glad on this edition. And I think voting matters. Voting has consequences. And that's what we're discussing today. And we're glad to have a distinguished panel. I greet everyone on behalf of the NNPA.
Absolutely. And Dr. Chavis, the news this morning, children ages 5 to 11 can now receive vaccination against COVID-19. On Tuesday, November 2nd, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky signed off on the recommendation from the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Dr. Walensky's authorization, her signing off, allows healthcare providers, pharmacies, and clinicians to commence coronavirus vaccine shots to children aged 5 as early as this morning. Officials said that the shots are available. The Food and Drug Administration had previously authorized a 2-shot regimen. Each vaccine dose for the 5 to 11 age group contains 1/3 of that used for adolescents and adults. White House officials have determined that there's enough of the Pfizer vaccine for all 28 million children in America who are between the ages of 5 and 11. Pfizer officials said they placed the orders for the doses last month, and they already begun the process of preparing and packing the vaccine. So we actually start there with good news that children now under 12 from 5 to 11 are now eligible for vaccination, and we see just how vital that is with schools opening this fall, and the virus still very much alive. So good news from Pfizer, good news from the CDC, Dr. Chavis.
Yes, it is good news. And the studies have shown that African American children also have a lot of pre-existing conditions, even between the age of 5 and 11. So the availability of this vaccine, I'm sure Black parents, African American parents, people of color communities are taking seriously this opportunity now to make sure they protect their children. That's one thing to protect all of the adults, but you also have to protect the children.
Yeah, and Dr. Chavis, Democrats were handed a resounding defeat yesterday in Virginia, and it looks like they are trying to hold on for the dear life in New Jersey. Governor Terry McAuliffe lost his reelection bid to Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, and a lot of people are saying that is really reflective of the leadership that people are really fed up with Democrats, or they sent a message at the very least that get your act together. Because in New Jersey, Dr. Chavis, a race that many believe would be a runaway for the incumbent, Phil Murphy, now has turned into a dead heat. This morning, they both wake up. Jack Ciattarelli, the Republican, and the incumbent Democrat Phil Murphy wake up to a virtual tie, and votes are still being counted in New Jersey. Also, election night did yield some other results that made history. New York mayoral race, Democrat Eric Adams defeated Republican Curtis Sliwa, and also making history, Michelle Wu becomes the first woman and person of color to win election as mayor of Boston. Ed Gainey becomes the first Black mayor of Pittsburgh, and Ken Welch becomes the first Black mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida. But overall, Dr. Chavis, devastating for Democrats to lose Virginia.
Well, I think we should take this in perspective. I think, particularly in the African American community, I think it shows the importance of our voting. It shows the importance of us being clear on why we're voting and who we're voting for, and not to take anything for granted. While it was a record voter turnout in 2020, this is 2021, just 1 year later. So I think even in a city like Atlanta, where I'm right now, there was some increased voting in some precincts, but some low voting in other precincts. And I think that no city or no state in America should be taking anything lightly. I think some Democrats won, some Democrats lost, some Republicans won, some Republicans lost. But I would say overall, American democracy won last night. Some of the people that are claiming voter fraud, they're not able to claim voter fraud now in Virginia. So I think that the glass is not half empty. I think it's still half full, but it also means we have work to do, particularly in the African American community. We got to make sure that the George Floyd Police and Justice Act, Justice and Policing Act is enacted. And we have to make sure that the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill is also enacted, which Senator Schumer now said he's going to bring before the Senate.
Yeah. And Dr. Chavis, something else that was on the ballot out of Minneapolis, there was a ballot measure to change over the police department, to eliminate the police department and have a department of public safety. Michelle Gross, she represents United Against Police Brutality, the Communities United Against Police Brutalities Project. Also, we also have, this morning, Al McFarlane of Insight News, one of our publishers there, and James Wright of the Washington Informer. We're going to say good morning to each of them to discuss this and the other topics this morning. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Michelle Gross.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. So let's start. Al, you're on the ground. You got your feet on the ground, the boots on the ground in Minneapolis. Tell us, you and Michelle Gross, set it up for us. What happened there with this ballot measure?
Well, Minneapolis is a DFL, a Democratic Farmer Labor Party town. So it's not a question of Republicans and Democrats here. It's a question of how the Democratic Party will see itself and go forward. The challenge, the stress, is from the progressive, newer voters who, in reaction to the horror of the George Floyd murder, and then the elevation of awareness about the history and continuance of egregious behavior against Black people, that voting bloc emerged in ways that it never has before. The consequence has been that we had more voters in early voting and more at the polls voting at historical records here in Minnesota. And the question really was, do we keep the current police department and motivate it or accept its statement that it's prepared to reform in an aggressive way, or do we say it's beyond reform and do a massive, aggressive, new imagination, reimagine what it means? And that's what the points of tension were. Do we reimagine policing altogether, get rid of what exists, or do we figure out how we make what we have work and build out to a future that's equitable and fair? And with the close vote, even though the ballot measure failed, the issue is not resolved. And I say it's a good thing because it means everybody's paying attention.
Yeah, and Michelle Gross, I know your organization was not for this ballot measure, but you are against any type of police brutality, and you have some interesting bullet points that you believe will help change the culture of policing. First of all, your reaction to the ballot measure, and tell us what your organization wants to see happen with the Minneapolis Police Department.
Well, thank you for having me this morning. Part of the problem is that the ballot measure itself, there were well-meaning people on both sides of this question, but the ballot measure itself wasn't very clear. What it essentially proposed is to give the police to the city council. And I think that the no vote is more of an indictment of the city council because, frankly, a lot of the city council members lost their seats as well last night. And so I think it was a kind of a vote of no confidence for the city council rather than, a straight up, for or against police accountability measure. And so I think that that's a thing to keep in mind. And so what it says now is that we've got a lot of work to do. And we were saying this anyway. There was no magic wand, no easy way to address policing issues in Minneapolis. And so passing this ballot measure wasn't going to even do that. It was simply going to move the council to the police to the city council. And it did do one other thing that we thought was important. The one part we did support, which is to remove from our city charter, which is like our city constitution, a measure that required a minimum staffing level for police. It's an operational detail that doesn't belong in the charter. And unfortunately, it didn't pass last night or yesterday, but at the same time, it can be passed by the council without being on the ballot. So they could have taken care of this anytime they wanted to. They chose to, not take care of it. And so now we've got to say to ourselves, what is our city council going to actually do? And as you said, we've got many proposals of things that could be done all along the way. For example, we could require police officers to carry their own professional liability insurance. There's a lot of measures that need to be put into place. I think the voters just basically said this isn't the way to do it.
Yeah, and James, right, she mentioned, Michelle Gross mentioned the liability protection or insurance, I should say, for police officers. How do you imagine that helping the cause of stopping police brutality?
Well, as you know, police liability protects police officers in the case of egregious violations of people's rights. A lot of people, before this George Floyd incident took place, a lot of people didn't know that police officers had liability. They just assumed that police officers could do whatever they wanted to do. Here in the district, we have a similar situation, but we have a strong defund the police movement, but we haven't gone as far as Minneapolis has gone. I think this is an area, Stacey, that needs more debate. I think it's quite appealing to say that police should carry their own liability. I think that's quite appealing, but there still needs to be a debate on this because there's public ramifications of this in terms of taxpayer dollars.
Well, isn't that the point, though, Dr. Chavis? If these police officers are forced to carry some sort of liability, personal liability, it would kind of make them pause before they do things like put their knee on George Floyd's neck for 10 seconds or whatever it was, or 10 minutes, I should say, and go in, bust into Breonna Taylor's house and shoot her. Isn't that the point, Dr. Chavis?
Absolutely, that's the point. And we need measures that hold police officers more accountable. And I think the liability insurance is one, it's not the only one. We also should make a law that the police officers need to be residents of the communities in which they police. There should not be an external occupying army that comes in particular people of color communities and then victimize those communities rather than protect and serve those communities. So I think what Michelle Gross and what Al McFarlane are saying and what James Wright is saying, this is a national issue. We still don't have an end to racially motivated police brutality in America. It's still a serious problem. And the Congress so far, at least on the Senate side, has failed to act. But I think also at state legislatures and at city councils, I think what happened last night across America, including Minnesota, is that people now are realizing that at the end of the day, people who vote can help shape public policy. People who don't vote will be the victims of the public policy, particularly when it does not serve the interests of the community.
And Al and
Mhm.
McFarlane and Michelle Gross, I want to go back to you two and have this discussion in Minneapolis. Where do you guys go from here? I know that the work that Michelle is doing through her organization, it doesn't stop because of an election. In fact, as we stated, they was not for that ballot, but they are for other types of changes. Where do we go from here in Minneapolis in the wake? We're still, George Floyd is still, fresh in everybody's mind, even though it was last year. Um, where do we go from here in Minneapolis?
Two things. One, I think the personal liability issue is a big one because often when incidents occur, then you find out that an officer may have a whole suitcase of prior investigations or charges, all of which have been dropped or kept quiet out of the public light. And if you have a requirement for professional liability insurance that has the duty and function of examining the history of service, and if a person has 25 tickets or charges over some period of time, that would make that person less insurable, probably, and therefore not able to serve without the insurance requirement. So I think it's a big deal to have that cost be borne by the individual officer. It will weed out bad actors, I believe. That's one thing. In Minneapolis, the question of the defund the police or not was also tied to how the city itself is structured, how it's managed. Ballot question number one decided whether there'd be a strong mayor system, like St. Paul, Minnesota has, or a continuation and consolidation of shifting authority for the executive function of the city, including the police department, to the city council. And so part of the contest was about these two things in tandem. Will the mayor have the authority as a strong executive and control of the police department, or will that office be further reduced in power? And will the turf or fiefdoms of the city council members expand in power? And that was on the ballot as well. So,
Yeah.
Stacy, may I make 2 quick points? In terms of Dr. Chavis talking about police officers living in the communities that they serve, in the District of Columbia, only 16% of MPD officers live in the district. They live other places, whether it be Pennsylvania or even some in West Virginia. And that's a very powerful point that he made. The second thing is that as we talk about this police liability issue, we have to understand that police officers' behavior at the end of the day rests on them. And so if they decide that they want to ignore their training and beat up people and kill people, then they should be liable for that.
Yeah, well, no question about it, James. It also lies in their partners too, right? We have to hold them accountable, and which is what we're seeing in the George Floyd situation. Those other officers, their trial begins early next year. They're being held accountable too. They didn't commit the act, but they didn't stop it either. Michelle Gross, your organization has been pushing for different types of reforms. What's next for you guys? What do you see as the objective right now as we speak? Because a lot of times we'll say, well, what do you see 5 years from now or next year? What do you see right now that can be done?
The thing about this this ballot measure is that it wasn't, I don't think, so much about whether or not we should have police reform, but more like what it should look like. And a lot of people, I don't think, felt that ballot measure that was as well defined as it should be. It was sort of vague. We'll move the police under the city council, and then they'll figure out what it looks like later. And people want more, secure and more sure way forward than just kind of a vague measure like that. And so I think that there was more of an indictment on the way that the ballot measure was written because it wasn't well defined. But I do think that people here really want to see the problems of policing addressed. I don't think that this was any way of the public saying we don't think the police need to change. I know that people feel they need to change, and there are several things we're doing. We're working in coalition with other organizations nationally to try to end qualified immunity, both in our state as well as on the national level. We've got we're working with the Department of Justice investigation that is happening right now around the Minneapolis police. We, for example, have held 24 or so community forums about the Department of Justice investigation to bring people into what's happening with that investigation and to make sure the community's at the table. We've also collected like 1,400 or so experiences of members of the community that we've shared with the DOJ. So we think that DOJ investigation is important. We want to continue to work for to require police to carry professional liability insurance, which has happened in Colorado, is probably going to happen soon in New York, and yet we haven't been able to get it across the finish line here where we came up with the idea. And we've got several other measures. People can see them on our website, and really check out the ideas. And there's many things. What I really think this vote says is that there's no magic wand for fixing the problem. We've got to dig in and we've got to take the individual measures, and there's lots of them. And so we want to see our city now adopt those individual measures and really push for the kinds of policing that we deserve in this community.
Yeah, and let me as we get back to, I just want to get back to the Democrats' loss in Virginia yesterday, and some other election points. We have one of our viewers mentioning that in one of the blackest Democratic districts in the country, less than 18% turned out to vote. We have to re-educate those who don't vote to see their wants, needs, and hopes in those who are running for office. If they don't see this, they are not going to vote. And I think that's to Dr. Chavis's point. But Al and James and Dr. Chavis, this message that we say was sent, it seems like it was sent to Democrats. Where do they go from here? I know I've asked this question about other things, but where do they go? Does this really signal that they need to get their act together?
Let me jump in. I think that the question is, where's the money going? Who manages the money? I've often said that in problem solving in Minnesota, we get the misery, white folks get the money. What's happening now is a demand that resources to be applied to problem solving be resources that our community controls and benefits and grows with and through. The solutions have to come from and through us. Michelle works with a group called the Unity Community Mediation Task Force. They have created a group of young people's task force that is meeting in Black, Asian, Latino, Native American communities, bringing police officers, the chief, the mayor, even the union head in front of young people from 14 years old to 21, 24, 25, and having great dialogue. Number one, destroying this myth that police are invincible, unapproachable, unassailable, and therefore adversary. They're creating a pathway of equity and ownership of the function of public safety within the Black community, within the brown community, and the Native community. That's where we got to go. And we have to figure out where the money is going. One thing that's happened with the COVID plus George Floyd money, all that goes under the banner, in my view, of the reckoning, lots of money assembled. How do we ensure that money gets infused into building knowledge, capability, awareness, and proper outcomes managed by, conceived by, controlled by our people?
Well, he mentioned, the money. Dr. Chavis, James.
I agree. I think that McFarlane really put it. Listen, we're getting ready to go into 2022. Those are when all of the midterm elections are going to happen. And there are hundreds of millions, even over $1 billion has already been raised to contest the midterm elections. The question is, how will that money be spent? Who is it going to be spent with? That's why the Black press is so important. I know a lot of times, even here in Atlanta, people say, well, You can get all the messaging out. Well, you spend all the money on mainstream media. You don't spend the
Mhm.
money on media that's controlled and owned by people of color. And you wonder why the messages doesn't get out to our people the way it should in a response from our people. So what Al's saying is correct. And I think even in institution building and reform, I think the people who need reform should be in charge of formulating the reform. Right? And I think a lot of times we make the process more complicated than it should be. So
Mhm.
yes, we have to follow the money. We have to energize our voters. I think what I learned from last night, even watching things here in the city of Atlanta, a great city, but I also learned there were mixed messages. And I think that we have to be much more focused, almost like a laser. Of Dr. King said it best in his last book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And I think we have to, what Minneapolis is saying, we need community. What Wisconsin is saying, we need community. What Mississippi and Alabama and Florida, Georgia, I'm gonna start calling all the states. So we need more community. We need more coalition building around the right set of principles. So I think we have to roll up our sleeves. Don't get frustrated. We have to learn from history. And I think last night, Stacy, is a great teaching moment for everyone involved about how to uh, work harder to make the American democracy truly inclusive, truly diverse, with celebrating the diversity rather than fearing the browning of America, rather than fearing the inclusion of people of color at all levels of government, not just at the top, but from the bottom up.
Yeah, and Dr. Chavis, to your point, that someone writing in on Facebook under the name "The Narrative Matters," they just before you said what you said, they said that there was no real push to educate Black voters and galvanize them to come out in Virginia, and at least not with the Black press. I'm going to give Michelle Gross the last word here. Michelle, we didn't get a chance to hear the rest of your answer, but anything else you would in addition to that, anything else you'd like us to know about your organization, the Communities United Against Police Brutality?
Well, thank you for asking. We are in our 21st year. We're not new, and we've been pushing for a long time for meaningful change that will actually address police brutality in a real way. Again, I think last night, there were good people on both sides of this question. And I think the answer now is to roll up our sleeves and get busy, because there's no question that we need to change policing in this community as well as across the country, and we need to bring everybody to the table to do it. This was the vote last night, or yesterday, was on the idea itself of the charter amendment. It was not a vote about police accountability. People want police accountability, they just didn't want it in that particular fashion. So we've got now to get busy. We've got to bring all of our neighbors and community to the table. Al has it exactly right that that there's work to be done, and we've got to get busy doing it. And the people who are most affected by police brutality need to be at the forefront of making it happen. So we've got to get together as a community and push for those changes that we want to see.
Well, Michelle Gross, the president of the Communities United Against Police Brutality, we really thank you for joining the Black Press this morning. Al McFarlane, Insight News, check him out. He has the scoop throughout Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota. And of course, James Wright. James, we know we're going to have you back. And Dr. Chavis, safe travels out there to the boss. We want to get you back to DC in one piece. And everybody, we close with a Black fact. Hiram Rose Revels was the first African American ever elected to the U.S. Senate. He represented the state of Mississippi from February 1870 to March 1871. Black fact from the Black Press. Everybody stay safe, wear a mask, get yourself the vaccine if you can, and we will see you tomorrow.